Yep.
So how do you want to do this, Indy?
Oh,
It's up to you. You're the boss.
yes. Would you like to have? Would you like to ask some questions first, or a comment or anything?
I think we have a ton of questions, but did you
Okay.
want to do a presentation first?
No.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I mean, I could, but you know, my son Malik heard me give a talk. He's now 37 years old. When he was 5 years old, I gave a talk to a group of teachers. And afterwards, he said it was pretty good, but I went on too long. And then he said the professors get paid by the word. And I thought, boy, that's pretty brilliant for a 5-year-old. So no, I have nothing to say. You all figure it out.
Okay.
Anybody?
Well,
Comments?
if we did a Q&A, I can
Yes.
start. I have 3 questions
Ah.
to start
Okay.
off with. First question, how did you come up with the name Weatherman or Weather Underground? Second, what was the transition like from being physically underground and then becoming a professor at the University of Chicago in education, of all things, not like poli-sci or something like that. And then third, do you take issue with anything that the scholars in this film say? So those 3 to start off with. And by the way, if somebody wants to ask questions in Finnish, they can also do that, so we'll translate.
We can share this.
Okay.
And I'll try to be brief. You're a professor of North American Studies. You have to know where the name came from. So I'll tell you. In any case, it comes from a line from Bob Dylan. And we had written, you know, I think some of the historiography here isn't quite right, but certainly in 1969, the student movement was facing a crisis, and the crisis was that we had convinced the majority of the American people to oppose the war. In 1965, a tiny minority opposed the war. By 1968, a majority opposed the war, but the war could not be ended. It kept grinding on. And as I said in the film, every week that went on, 6,000 people were murdered with no end in sight. How do you stop it? What do you do? And the movement split. Democracy was in crisis. In my own family, I'm the middle of 5 children. One of my brothers joined the Democratic Party to build a peace wing. One of my brothers went to Canada to avoid the madness. One of my brothers went to a commune. One organized the industrial working class in a factory in the Midwest. And I was part of a group that created this attempt to survive what we thought of as an impending American fascism and to take the war to the war makers through sabotage, and that's what we did. None of us was crazy, even though I'm often portrayed as crazy, but I wasn't crazy. And none of us was successful. We didn't end the war. But as we were figuring out which way to go forward, in our confusion, despair, hope, we wrote a manifesto, a small group of us. Burroughs said it was 12 of us. That's probably about accurate. And we wrote a manifesto, and it was a big, thick, complicated political statement, a close reading of which would drive you blind because it was little print and it was horrible. No, it was good in many ways, but it was, you know, overwrought in many ways. And we couldn't, and then when it came time to publish it, Terry Robbins, who was killed in the townhouse, was a fan of Bob Dylan. And he took a line from Bob Dylan, and the line was, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." And the irony of the title was it was whimsical and silly. And we're saying you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, meaning that third world revolution is sweeping the world and everybody can see that. You don't need somebody to tell you that. Meanwhile, we were telling you that in small print. So that was the irony. And we could take, he could have taken another line from that same Highway 61 Revisited. He could have taken the line, Subterranean Homesick Blues. Another line that he thought about was, "The pump don't work because the Vandals took the handles." And then we would have been called the Vandals. But in any case, that's where the name comes from. And your second question was about becoming a professor. I had been a teacher starting in 1965 of young children, and I taught for 3 years and then became a full-time organizer against the war. So being a teacher was not new or strange to me. I went underground. When we were underground, we had our first child, and I went back to teaching. So I had been away from teaching for about a decade, but I became a teacher again, and then when we surfaced, I got a doctorate and became a scholar of education. So that's how that happened. And you know, one of the things that I think is easy to misunderstand is that it seems like there's such a great break from being a teacher to being a weatherman to being a professor. To me, it's all part of the same piece. It doesn't seem particularly odd to me at all. I mean, I am a radical teacher. I was a radical political person. I still am. I'm an activist. But teaching and activism don't seem to me in contradiction. When Jeremy Verone, he's really the only scholar in the film. I'm not. I'm a stunt scholar. And Burroughs is a journalist. He's not really a scholar. But when Jeremy Verone says, so interesting that this contradiction, on the one hand, they were these radical underground people. On the other hand, they were changing the sheets. That doesn't seem odd to me at all. I mean, what the fuck are you supposed to do? Not change the sheets? You know, I'm so radical that I don't intend to change the sheets. You know, it's ridiculous. So this idea that somehow you're living in some suspended other world where you don't go shopping or do your laundry or sweep the house, I mean, of course you do those things. It's life. And in many ways, I think that, you know, you can kind of get yourself into a position where you think being a political person is a full-time occupation that requires you to be an absolute weirdo. And okay, I'll accept the weirdo part, but still I would change the sheets now and then. You know. And your last question was, do I have any issues with the scholars?
Yeah.
Many. And as said to India and Essie, that you know, I really respect what they've done, and I take my hat off to both of you. I think that it's a hard story to tell, and they told one version of a complicated story. I've told my own versions. So when somebody said to me the other day, a couple days ago, somebody said, well, in your film, and I clarified, it's not my film, it's their film. They're the authors of the film. I'm just a puppet in the film. But I think it's important that it's a complicated film, and I think the greatest compliment you could give to a film like this is they worked hard to tell an honest story by being curious, intellectually honest, having the integrity to search for answers, and I think they did a phenomenally good job. But do I take issue with certain things? Absolutely. I think it's very easy for Brian Burroughs, for example, to say that the Weathermen, kind of wrecked SDS and not taking into account many other things. Or the Weathermen were this kind of completely weird phenomenon that had this townhouse explosion. What's left out of that story is that the week after the townhouse, two very important and lovely members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Civil Rights Student Organization, our sister organization, two members of that organization were killed in a bomb explosion, an accident in Washington, D.C., apparently taking a bomb to the Capitol. So it was weird and terrible and illegal and questionable, and as Obama says, detestable, is that what he said? Something like that. That's one way to look at it, absolutely. But the idea that it was a tiny little thing that happened over here by a group of nuts is not quite right. So, and I took a lot of issue with some of the other things Burroughs said, but I don't have to get into it.
Okay.
Oh, good. You're not shy. Good. I was worried that being Finnish people, you were all going to be shy, but no.
Yeah, shy. So I'd like to ask, were you prosecuted or did you go to prison for your involvement with the Weathermen?
No, I was one of the people who didn't go to prison, and there are a couple things that are worth saying about that. One is that the only charges against me, the only legal charges against me, were conspiracy charges, conspiracy to cross state lines to destroy government property, conspiracy to create urban unrest. And those conspiracy charges were dropped before I turned myself in. The reason they were dropped was not a technicality. They were dropped because the FBI, which is in the news again in the United States, I don't know if you're following it, but President Trump fired the director of the FBI, and there's giant crocodile tears being shed by the Democrats. The FBI had committed unbelievably egregious illegal acts in searching for us. Among the acts was they had a written plan signed off by J. Edgar Hoover to kidnap Bernadine's and my nephew, who was 2 years old. They were going to kidnap him in order to make Bernadine turn herself in. When that became public through the afterlife of Watergate, all charges against us were dropped, because there's not a jury in the world, I mean, in the world maybe, not the jury in the United States that would actually convict, that would actually sanction the FBI kidnapping a 2-year-old to get his aunt to turn herself in, right? So the charges technically against me were dropped. Bernadine still had charges against her. She was put on probation, and she ended up doing close to a year in prison because she refused to testify before a grand jury. And that's another long, complicated story. But I did not do time. There's one other thing to mention about that, which is white supremacy, which is quite, central to the American experience, also plays out here. It plays out in Kathy Wilkerson says there are many Black Panthers doing life in prison. One of our comrades two of our comrades are still in prison, doing life in prison. But many, many more Black revolutionaries are in prison. That's a reflection of white supremacy visited on the left. So, no, I never did is the short answer. And I was very lucky in that regard. And I feel when I see footage of Diana Outten, when I see Terry Robbins, it excites in me all the grief and terror that we felt at the time. And it never goes away from me. But to see it vividly like this is, a stark reminder of the loss and the risk and the mistakes that we made, which were consequential.
Okay, I have another question. Were you or the weathermen in any way supported by the CIA or another governmental organization?
No.
Because I googled your name and there were some people on the internet claiming that you were CIA or something. So you're saying no?
Nope, no CIA. I still got my SDS card, but my CIA card missing. No, it's a standard thing. There's two things you find if you Google me, and I love it. People often say to me, "I know everything about you because I Wikipedia." Yeah, I don't even know everything about me, no, the kind of the right wing interpretation of that phenomenon is that we were part of the communist plot and we were KGB. But there is a conspiracy kind of notion always that if you don't die or get killed, then you must have been an agent of the state.
You have the communist star there.
Is that a communist star? It's also the symbol of Beck's Beer and Macy's department store, but okay, I'll accept it as communism. It's funny that symbols like this are funny. For me, it has always represented third world liberation from US imperialism. But for other people, it represents Beck's Beer, so I'm open to any interpretation.
So I have a question regarding COINTELPRO. Could you say a few words about how aware you were of the FBI infiltration and repression, and with regard to Fred Hampton on Mark Clark?
Yeah. Well, COINTELPRO was this government program to disrupt and destroy the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and any progressive movement. And we were not aware of it technically as a thing, but we instinctively felt it. So we talked there in the film about the fact that we felt from the moment it happened that Fred Hampton was assassinated by the police. It took years to prove it, but we knew it was true. And so you're in this kind of funny netherworld between fact and fiction, but we felt the pressure of COINTELPRO. We felt the reality of it. A group of people in the early 1970s broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and released these documents. And for years, people thought we had done it. And for years, I would ask people, did you do it? I mean, who did it? Because we didn't do it, but we wish we'd done it. But it was a little obscure FBI office in Pennsylvania. These documents were released to the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post, and eventually the New York Times. And it came out there was a secret government program to not only to discredit and expose Martin Luther King to attack. There was a government program to disrupt and murder Black Panthers. there was a government program to infiltrate us and turn us against each other. So these things existed, and we felt it. We knew it was true kind of instinctively, but proof of it only came out years later. And it's worth noting, just again, because the FBI is in the news, the FBI is the political police of the United States and always has been. The FBI was founded to disrupt anarchists, socialists, and communists in the 1920s. J. Edgar Hoover founded it. J. Edgar Hoover was at the helm of it. I joke in the film about the fact that J. Edgar Hoover and I agreed that Bernadine Dorn was the most dangerous woman in America. The astonishing thing is, when Hoover was first at the helm of the FBI, he called Jane Addams, the great Chicago social reformer, the most dangerous woman in America. And 50 years later, still at the helm of this criminal enterprise, he calls Bernadine the most dangerous woman in America. What a weird thing. And now here we are. They disrupted the civil rights movement. They infiltrated, they were standing next to Malcolm X when he was killed. I mean, it wasn't an innocent organization. And so to see the American news media today going crazy about Trump firing Comey and saying, oh my God, the integrity of the FBI, we count on its integrity. What integrity? They're a bunch of murderous idiots and also incompetent. And the fact that they couldn't find us is kind of astonishing too, when they had this reputation, G-men, the reason people were put on the 10 most wanted list is because they would then catch them a week later and say, see, we're brilliant. Bernadine was on the 10 most wanted list for the longest period of anyone and never captured. Angela Davis was on the 10 most wanted list, Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown. It's crazy. So it's a political police, and we shouldn't, on the one hand, you want to object to Trump firing somebody who's investigating him. On the other hand, don't get silly about the FBI. They are the political police of the United States.
Thank you. Thanks for your, great story that you told, and I specifically would have a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to hone in on the part where you talk about the paradigm shift that's needed. And I'm totally with you in seeing that work, the kind of reframing of work.
Jobs and work, yeah.
Yeah, so, and I think that there's like a lot of signs of optimism on that front, and kind of like smaller local initiatives that are kind of rejecting the capitalist system and building their own work. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, now I'm using the phrase from there, but taking it to the next level. How do we mobilize those small local initiatives into something bigger to really get that paradigm shift going on?
I don't know. but I do know, here's what I think is important for all of us to be thinking about collectively together. I don't know what the steps are that are needed. What I do know, and if you're honing in on the shift in paradigm around work and jobs, what's extraordinary in the United States, and I think in Europe as well, and in other places, in Cuba, in Latin America, is the growing energy of workers' cooperatives, the growing energy of workers taking over the means of production in various places in various ways. And I think that's a hopeful thing, and figuring out, I wouldn't call myself an optimist in anything, even though I'm often accused of being an optimist because I'm sunny. I have a sunny outlook on life, but I'm not optimistic, nor am I pessimistic, because I think both optimists and pessimists think they know what's coming, and I have no idea what's coming. And because I have no idea, I try to keep my antenna up and pay attention to what's going on. If the kids who occupied Wall Street had called me the night before they occupied Wall Street and said, we're thinking of occupying Wall Street, what do you think? We're going to pitch tents and overthrow capitalism that way. I would have said, are you nuts? That's going to do nothing. Are you crazy? The next day, of course, I showed up because they were doing it, and it was marvelous, So I feel this is always the case, that the day before Rosa Parks sat in on the bus, that revolution was impossible. The day after, that revolution was inevitable. So our job is to keep our antenna up and keep doing our work. The rhythm of activism, it seems to me, is always the same, but always more complicated in its details than it is to just explain the rhythm. The rhythm is open your eyes, pay attention. If you're not paying attention, you can't act in the world. So you have to keep opening your eyes. Not once, not getting one good idea and then having it blind you as a single light bulb in a dark room, but constantly opening your eyes and reassessing and rethinking. You have to be astonished at both the beauty and the ecstasy in the world, but also the horrible crimes we visit on one another. Then you have to act, and then you have to doubt. And what the weathermen did in that treacherous period in 1969-70, what we did was we forgot to doubt, and we became stuck in our ideology, in our dogma, in our, orthodoxy. That's dangerous. So if you do that, if you open your eyes, be astonished, act, doubt, and then repeat, that, it seems to me, is the way forward. The other thing to say about optimism, I'm often accused of being optimistic. I'm also, and my mother was an optimist, and she was a Pollyanna, and I have the genetic problem. But I'm often accused of being utopian, and Indy has a book that I wrote that's kind of a utopian manifesto. But somebody said, a friend of mine actually said, what good is utopia? And the answer is it's true that if you take 2 steps towards utopia, utopia takes 2 steps the other way. If you take 10 steps towards utopia, utopia walks the other way. And so the question, what good is utopia? And the clear answer is, it's good for walking. And that's what we have to do. We have to keep trying. And that's why having a vision of what might be possible, it seems to me, is very important.
Hi, so I have a question about media and your relationship to that. I'm thinking of like the 1968 convention and the whole world is watching Chen. So I want to take it in 2 directions. First off, news media. How much were you, like the civil rights movement, trying to stage events for the attention of the news media? And then the second question, entertainment media, and I'm thinking here again of the civil rights movement, where somebody like Stokely Carmichael contacted television producers in the 1970s, complaining about content or praising them about content. Were you ever attempting to change entertainment television?
I have no memory of anything having to do with entertainment media. And I have a complicated response to the question of media, because I often think that people who are trying to do projects like workers' cooperatives, or people who are trying to build new schools, or people who are trying to create liberated spaces, spend too much time thinking about a media strategy, when what they ought to be thinking about is, how do I make this thing work without the media affirming or disaffirming me? We kind of get, in the modern world, we get drawn to the seductive eye of the media, and I worry about that. I also worry when I hear people complaining about the media. Donald Trump complains about the media, but the lefties always are whining about what they didn't get from the media, and I find that to be, a little bit weird. Obviously, we were getting attention. We were having an attention deficit getting disorder or something. We were trying to issue a cry, a response. But I also think it's worth noting that we, back then and we now, and workers' co-ops or those kind of things as well, we have a responsibility to create our own media. We have a responsibility not to look for affirmation with CNN or CBS or anybody else. So it always bores me when we have a demonstration and then there's a little argument about how many people were on the mall. The New York Times said 50,000. I'm sure there were 60,000. Who gives a shit? Really. It's not that important. What's important is that we find ways to communicate with each other. And frankly, every revolution, every movement, every social movement has had its own media, as well as a media strategy, but it's had its own media. And I think young people today are brilliant at using media to talk to one another. And the fact that people my age aren't part of it is probably a good thing. But so I have a complicated reaction to it. I don't have any relationship to or understanding of entertainment media, except I met Indy and Essie, that's it. Are you guys the entertainment media? I don't know.
I have no idea.
Anybody else?
Okay, I would like to go back to another documentary film made in the 1970s, Emily D'Antonio's Underground.
Oh, with D'Antonio,
Yeah,
Emile D'Antonio's film and Haskell Wexler's film, Underground, right?
yeah. So, how do you feel when you watch it now? I mean, how do you feel about it when you watch it now?
Oh, you know, a couple of feelings. One is, even when I watch something like this, I'm horrified to see myself on the big screen. Horrified, because you don't think you look like that, or did I really say that shit? You know, so it's complicated. But D'Antonio was a famous American filmmaker who really, in many ways, is credited with confronting and bringing down McCarthyism in the 1950s. A left-wing filmmaker, educated at Harvard, very, very good guy. And his cinematographer was Haskell Wexler, who's a Oscar-winning cinematographer. So they contacted us, and we made a film with them, that we allowed them to make a film, partly interviewing us underground. And we were all wearing, I don't know, weird disguises and shit, and the cinematography was coming through a mirror at the rear. I don't remember. But I saw it maybe 20 years ago, so maybe 20 years after it was made. I saw the film with a group of young radicals, and I had two responses. On the one hand, I was embarrassed about many, many aspects of it, just, you know, how silly we were in some ways. On the other hand, I thought the politics stood up remarkably. So the politics of that film, I agree with. That is, our analysis was that there's a third world revolution going on, and the responsibility of conscious people inside the mother country of empire is to side with those people who are fighting for self-determination. And that included the black struggle and the Chicano struggle, but it included, most importantly, Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau, Cuba, South Africa. So I found the politics stood up very, very well. Some of the rhetoric was overheated. Some of the expressions were juvenile, I suppose. But I thought the film stood up. So, and Haskell, D'Antonio and Haskell and us stayed friends until the end of their lives. Haskell died this year. Yeah, so I was very happy that we did that and got to know them. They were both remarkable artists.
I could have another question related to idea of revolution. Now, when people are talking about revolution, I think that nowadays say that maybe the far right or right wing has a more appeal related to our revolution. What would you say to a young radical right winger whose idea of revolution is maybe a little bit different than yours?
Well, I mean, I think when we talk about, you know, revolution is one of those words, like, there's so many words we could get into, but revolution is one of those words that means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. So we have, in the United States, revolutionary deodorant and revolutionary automobiles. I mean, you know, it's crazy. So what does it actually mean? And to me, the question that I would ask a right-winger in general is, what kind of a world do we want? And if we want a world of more peace, more democracy, more justice, in which we look at one another as equals, where we see every human being as an infinite universe of possibilities, and we respect every human being equally. If that's the world we want, then we do need a social revolution. But a social revolution isn't a coup d'etat, and it's not it's not a violent overthrow necessarily. What it is a changing of class positions, and it's a massive undertaking. It's a mass shift. I think that we've seen, you know, real revolutions in the last century. Most of them have not ended well, but that doesn't mean that the attempt, that the goal of creating a society that's just and equal it's a worthy goal. A right-wing revolution actually wants to, create a kind of authoritarian structure. I mean, we're witnessing a right-wing push right now in the United States, and it's terrifying because it encodes hierarchy, it encodes privilege. It encodes privilege in the United States on traditional bases of of race and class, and that's what I oppose. So it's a longer conversation. I'll meet the right-wingers out there afterwards. Everybody's so polite. I want you to be raucous. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I understood you're from Chicago, right?
Yes, indeed.
So basically Chicago was kind of a flashpoint for the new left in America with the Democratic Convention and going forward. So I just kind of like how did you grow up to be this radical? Like, of course you're seeing all that's going on and the Democratic Convention and Robert Kennedy before that being murdered and the duplicity of the Democratic Party like manifesting itself during the riot and stuff like that was one of the questions, and the other question was like, how have you been treated by your peers, like after all this, like when you have grown up and become a professor, and have you, like, from your immediate associates and from time who probably didn't agree with you, how have they like approached you?
You mean people like radicals thinking that I sold out, or do you mean like my class upbringing thinking I was too radical?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's alluded to in the film, but my father was the chairman of the electric monopoly in Chicago. He was the chairman of Commonwealth Edison. So I grew up in tremendous privilege, and as I say, I was the middle of 5 children, and I was sent away to prep school, to boarding school, and I graduated from boarding school in 1963. So I lived a very sheltered life, and I grew up in the 50s, which was a period in America of peak oil, peak prosperity, peak everything, peak peace. You know, so it was a spongy kind of a weird kind of world where not too much that was controversial slipped across the hedges into our little safe, privileged, sheltered world. Then I went to the University of Michigan in 1963, and I got caught up in and joined the civil rights movement. And that's what changed my life more than anything, was the idea that in this kind of fantasy of America, post-World War II America, apartheid was a very real part of the scene. And I got very committed very quickly to ending apartheid in the United States. And then the war came along, and borrowing tactics and strategies from the Black Freedom Movement, we created an anti-war movement that we got arrested, we went to jail, we fought the police, all these things happened in that upheaval. So what radicalized me was, I feel like I was just lucky in the sense that I went to the University of Michigan at a time of social upheaval, and the Black movement was creating the moral kind of dimensions of what was possible in society, and the anti-war movement was a powerful place to represent your moral hope for a peaceful world, a world in balance, a world in which the United States would not be the uber nation, but would be a nation among nations. And that's what brought me into the movement. The longer I was in the movement, the more radical I became. And the reason I think that's true for many, many people, probably for many of you. You probably know the story of Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King came into the movement in 1955, 56, a young preacher with, Christian ideals, pretty liberal. And by the time he died, 13 years later, he was an absolute radical. And that's one of the things that Chomsky refers to. It's hard for Americans, it's becoming easier, but it's hard for Americans to read the speeches of Martin Luther King between 1965 and 68, where he begins to call for revolution. And he says, we need a revolution in values in order to have a revolution in fact. That was the same journey we were on. That is, he said, we need to change our values. We need to see the 3 evils, he called them, of consumerism, materialism, racism, and militarism. We need to fight those 3 evils, and we need to connect them. I tell my students, if you read one thing by Martin Luther King, read the April 4th, 1967 speech at Riverside Church, in which he calls America the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, in which he calls for a revolution. And people read that and they can't believe, King said that? Yes, King said that. You can read him saying, I will not condemn the rioters in Los Angeles before I condemn my government, which is the greatest purveyor of violence. So it's hard for people to reconcile the kind of dream of king that Chomsky refers to with the real king. That's the same kind of voyage that we went on. You know, it was a complicated time, and you know, of course, the people I grew up with, many of them came in the same journey that I went on. So I went to this little privileged prep school. I think my graduating class had 39 young men. It was a boys' school. Something like a quarter of us became SDS members. That's a pretty high percentage from this little elitist prep school, right? But I think that we were all drawn to the idea that we could live a moral life, that we could live a life that was consistent with our values, and we wanted to try to do that, to live a life that didn't make a mockery of our values, and that drew us into social movements, and the social movements deepened our commitment, but it also expanded our goals. So if our goal was to end, you know, segregated buses in the South in year 1, in year 3 it was to end segregation generally, and by year 5 it was to end white supremacy. The dream kept expanding as well as the commitment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You can fight back though. Go ahead, tell me more.
Yeah. Well, would you care to elaborate, like how have you been treated by, let's say?
Oh, right.
Maybe people older than you. I don't want to ask about your parents if you don't want to
Well,
answer.
I'd
But
love to tell
like
about my
neighbors
parents.
and family and
Yeah,
relatives and those people who didn't want to rock the boat, and maybe they were liberal in the sense like you referred to as
To the babies in the river. Yeah.
metaphor and babies in the river. Yes.
Well, you know, I mean, initially, I think it was very difficult for people like my parents to understand what was going on, but they knew, as you guys tell me this song, something's happening here, but it isn't exactly clear. That clearance creep? No. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They knew something was going on. Oh, you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Bob Dylan. Okay. So they knew something was going on, and I remember there was one classic moment where my younger brother had decided that he had to go to Canada to avoid the military, and he went to Canada. We were
Where
both.
in Canada did he go?
Say?
Where in Canada did he go?
Initially Toronto, and he got a job at a theater, and the whole 2 years he was there, it showed The Graduate, and he was driven nuts by it, so he went to Vancouver. But my brother went to Canada. We were both students in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, and I had the harder job of going home and telling my parents that my brother had gone to Canada, you know, and it was hard, and I swallowed hard, and I went and had lunch with my parents in Chicago, and my dad, as I say, was this very important business executive, and my mother was a society lady, and we had lunch together, and I told them. My dad was furious that Rick had thrown away his life by going to Canada. And my mother, after my dad left, said, I don't know what it is with you kids. I don't know why you can't just get married and just get a job and just be normal. I don't get that. But I do know you're happier than any of the kids I know. You seem more sensible than any, except for the stupid things you do, you seem like really happy people. That was my mother. And the interesting thing about this society lady is she spent the next 5 years speaking against the war in Vietnam to her other society ladies. And that was kind of what was happening in America. Sports figures, you know, entertainment figures, people being disrupted by both the Black Freedom Movement and the anti-war movement. It's easy to kind of isolate something like the Weathermen and say it was this weird phenomenon. Go listen to the albums of Nina Simone at the time. It's filled with political radicalism. Listen to Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, who's a famous and favorite young black artist of the American scene in the 50s and 60s. She's calling for armed revolution. Lorraine Hansberry, for Christ's sake. So it was weird, but it was also general. And my parents came to grips with it, had to struggle with it. My father was as I say, he was the head of the public utility, so he had to go to stockholders meetings where people would stand up and denounce me. And that was painful for him, I'm sure. And we were underground for 11 years. We came back above ground, and one of the first people we saw were my parents. And they had not met Bernadine before, and they were glad to meet her and surprised that she was a Jew. You know, the weird things. And my father's first comment to me was, "You need a haircut." I thought, holy shit, you know, nothing changes, right? I'm his son, I'm now 30, whatever I was, 5 years old, and I need a haircut, for Christ's sake. You know, and her father, when we went and met with them, her father said, "Are you married?" Which had never occurred to us. No, we weren't married, but that was important to these middle class, you know. Anyway, my dad and I became, and have always been, good friends. He spent Bernadine's mother spent the last 5 years of her life living with us. My dad spent the last 3 years of his life living with us. They both had Alzheimer's, they both died in our home. When my dad died, I said to Bernadine, "We're so good at elder care, we should get an old person to move in." And she said, "You're already here." That was so unfair. Anyway, I want a caregiver.
All right, thank you very much for
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for inspiring talk. I really liked your comment, your definition on radical. But I'm curious about life underground.
Okay, and she has,
You
yeah.
must be a master at it because you managed to do 10 years. So I wonder, like, how did you get a living? Give us some tips.
Yeah.
Give her some tips.
Oh, tips, okay, yeah.
How to live underground.
Because you can't have a bank account, you can't have a job, and how do you get by? And another one is Obama. So what's your view on your friend Obama now after his presidency?
I like the way you said your friend in kind of spiritual, my friend Obama. Well, first of all, life underground. You know, I think what's really important, I mean, we did all the kind of spycraft things that you would imagine we did. We got fake ID. We figured out how to do that. We lived off the books. I mean, we worked in jobs that were in the underground economy, which was not that complicated. In fact, excuse me, when you are underground, you realize that you're bumping into a million other undergrounds all the time. So there are people, for example, in those days, there were not just people trying to get away from the army, from the war in Vietnam. There were women trying to get abortions. That was an entire underground in the United States, very complicated underground, where people who had unwanted pregnancies had to figure out how to illegally get them terminated. And so that was there. There was, of course, the mob and the drug underground. And I'll tell you one very funny story. I said in the film that we had payphone to payphone communications. So we were always on the lookout for great payphones to get a phone call at. So I found this great payphone just north of New York City at a Howard Johnson's, which was a series of hotels called Howard Johnson's. And at the Howard Johnson's restaurant, if you went down into the basement where the restrooms were, right between the restrooms were two wonderful phone booths. And it was away from the crowd, nobody would see you. So that was my phone booth where I got phone calls from Bernadine. And I went down there one day, and there were two guys sitting there who were obviously mafia. They were wearing these wool suits. They looked like, their expression on their face looked like they had wool suits with no underwear, and they were uncomfortable. And I'm, oh shit, what am I gonna do? So I go into the men's room, I hear the phone ring, and one of the guys answers it, and he opens the door of the men's room and says, "Yo, are you Joe?" I said, "Yes." He says, "It's for you." So he's waiting for a phone call, and I'm waiting for a phone call. Weird as shit. Stuff like that happened. But the important thing, actually, without kidding around, the important thing is that it's not about spycraft. It's actually about, you obviously do simple things like stay out of the places where you're typically, you know, we didn't visit our parents. We didn't go to the Haight-Ashbury, which is a hip neighborhood in San Francisco. We stayed away from those places, but the real secret to it is that we were supported by the anti-war movement. So even though I was recognized, Bernadine was recognized on the street every month for 11 years, no one turned us in. We would be at a movie theater. We were in LA and we'd gone to a movie, and I went into the men's room and I ran right into Tom Hayden, one of the founders of SDS. He didn't agree with me. He didn't think what I was doing was terrific, but he had no reason to call the police and have me turned in. So it was supported in that sense. even without supporting every action or even our analysis necessarily, we were part of a movement, and that's why we survived. And I think that's true of every revolutionary group you can think of around the world. You survive if you're part of a movement. You don't survive if you're all by yourself as a lone wolf. That doesn't work. So, did you have a second part? I can't
Yeah, the Obama.
Oh, yeah,
But
Obama,
also,
shit, I
as a
repressed
kind
it,
of
yeah.
bonus question for this one also, like, why did you decide to kind of come out of the underground after 10 years? What was the reason?
Oh, why did we? Well, we went underground, we went underground in 1970, and we went underground all of a sudden because things were bad and we knew they were getting worse, but when the townhouse happened, we all went underground. We thought of ourselves as a revolutionary organization. This is another disagreement with Burroughs. He has the numbers all wrong. The idea that we were 120 or we were 400, that's just nonsense. And people make that stuff up. But we were part of a movement, we were part of a big movement. And the movement was united around many things, but the true unity, it turns out, looking backward, was the war in Vietnam. When the war in Vietnam ended, the organization began to fall apart. And that's because what motivated us was the war itself. Even though we had deeper goals and more revolutionary analysis, the war was the thing that held us together, doing this crazy, difficult, complicated, risky work. It was the war, and then the war was over. As Kathy Wilkerson said, for 4.5 years, the organization existed. The war ended, and we more or less ended within a year. But several of us stayed underground, and what Bernadine would tell you if she were here was that Bill, said, let's go above ground, this is crazy. And she said, I'll never go above ground. So she's a very willful person, and she felt like she didn't want to give the state a victory, no matter what. And so she wanted to stay underground. And eventually she said, well, we had 2 kids underground. We now had we had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And she felt, and I had felt for a long time, and she came to feel that we would do better work if we did open political work in that period. And so we came above ground. We didn't know what the consequences would be. The consequences were very mild by comparison to what could have been. And she ended up going to prison for, as I say, close to a year. And that was a very difficult time for us. But it was, and I had at that point 3 little kids and was single parenting. And my empathy for single mothers went through the roof because I understood suddenly that it's way more than the physical part of parenting. It's the emotional, never getting a break from the emotional responsibility. So yeah, it was, that's why we did it. We did it because the war ended, and we did it because we thought we could be more effective as open political people. I went back and got a doctorate, became a professor. She, was a lawyer and became a law professor. Now you want to know about Obama. Okay. So, I thought Indy did a good job of showing the silliness of the narrative that somehow, people couldn't figure out how to oppose Obama when he ran for president in 2008. Hillary couldn't figure it out. McCain, Palin couldn't figure it out. So Hillary developed this idea that even though Obama said, I'm a middle-of-the-road, mainstream, pragmatic politician, the right wing looked at him and said, no, he's a secret Muslim who pals around with terrorists and has socialist and black nationalist tendencies. And the liberals looked at him and the left looked at him and said, I think he's winking at me. I think he's really a leftist. But Barack is exactly who he said he was, a middle-of-the-road, pragmatic politician. And as I said in the film, a compassionate guy, a decent guy, in many ways. But he ran for president to sit in the throne of empire and to command its violent legions. That's exactly what he did. It didn't surprise me, but that's what presidents do. But I think it's interesting that Hillary developed this narrative. We don't know him, and that ad was perfect. We don't know the guy, but we know he has a black nationalist minister, he has a terrorist friend, he has a Palestinian advisor. One of my favorite moments in the campaign, there's so many horrible things that happened, but at one point, CNN was interviewing some McCain official in Florida, and they said, Barack Obama has anti-Semitic friends. And the reporter said, "Who?" And he said, "Rashid Khalidi." Rashid is one of my best friends. He's a Palestinian scholar now at Columbia University. And the McCain official said, "Rashid Khalidi." And you know, Rashid couldn't be less anti-Semitic, but the name Rashid Khalidi, it just sounds anti-Semitic, right, to the American audience. So I said, "Rashid Khalidi," and the reporter says, "Who else?" And the guy says, "Bill Ayres." And the reporter says, "No, Ayres isn't anti-Semitic, he's a terrorist." And so Rashid called me up and he said, "Let's trade places. I'm sick of being an anti-Semite. You'll be the anti-Semite, I'll be the terrorist." But it was that crazy, the things that were going on. How do I assess his presidency? I think that, like every president in my life, he entered the office of a country that's the biggest military behemoth that's ever been constructed. That's a country based on white supremacy and the afterlife of slavery. And he did what presidents do. He, as I say, commanded its violent legions. He tried to do some decent things. He was blocked at every step by a really reactionary white supremacist movement. I couldn't have been more surprised when Donald Trump, I knew that Trumpism was a reality, but I was surprised when he got elected, and now we have Trumpism in the West Wing of the White House, and I think we have our work cut out for us. But I think Obama's presidency in the mainstream American political stream will look like a moderate success. Some of the things he did were decent, but a lot of what he did was horrible, and it was horrible for the same reasons that anyone sitting in that office would have done horrible things. The bombings, the destruction of Libya, the drone strikes in Yemen, I mean, these things are unconscionable, and the bowing down to Israel when, you know, he knows so much better than that. But again, it's the American political scene. You know, the American political scene is so backward on this that Bernie Sanders is considered a radical because he said during the campaign, "Palestinians are human beings also." What? You can't say that. Yeah, I mean, that's how weird our politics are. So I think, you know, does that go there? Okay, sorry.
How did you meet Obama?
Say?
How did you meet Obama?
Obama and I lived in the neighborhood, so when he called me on television, he said he's a guy around the neighborhood, and several of my friends said, "Boy, that's so dismissive." I said, "I don't think it's dismissive. I think of him as a guy around the neighborhood." We'd run into each other at the bookstore or shopping. Yeah, we shopped. Amazing. I know. We had to get food. But we met, officially we met, you know, the way that I got dragged into the campaign is we had the first fundraiser for Obama at our home. And our home is very much an open space where there's a lot of public events that go on. And the person, one of our friends who was a state legislator said, "You would really be helping this guy, this young guy, if you could just have some people over for coffee." So we did. And that became this big kind of proof that somehow we were, and I always said, you know, "Were you guys friends?" We knew each other, we were friends, but I like to say we didn't ever share a milkshake with 2 straws. We weren't intimate friends, you know, we were friends. And we were guys around the neighborhood. And he and I served on 2 boards together. I was the chairman of the board of a foundation that gave money to community organizers, and he was on that board. So that's the other way the right wing tried to make a relationship that didn't exist, you know, because we served on a board together. So that's how we knew each other. And as I say, I think he is a really decent human being besides being president, which is unconscionable.
Okay. Hi, I have one for the filmmakers.
For you. Yay!
You said in the beginning that this is a propaganda film, and the people who come to see this film, I guess many of us already buy these issues and these values that you present in the film. So you're kind of preaching to the converted here. So what it is that you want to achieve? Do you want us to stop going to movies and do something?
In a way, yes. And I also wanted to give, and that's why it's amazing that here he is talking a lot, because that was one of the reasons I made this movie, because I wanted to give freedom of speech finally, because no, of course in Finland it's different, but in the USA every time they say something, there is a big opposition, and they are saying like, no, you are wrong because you're a terrorist, and that has been happening since their times, 60s, 70s. So I think I hope that this film will go global, so that also in their own country they finally can say their wise words and nobody is blaming them to be something that they are not. That's the one reason. And then also I wanted to open up the conversation about, and actually I think in every Q&A somebody has been asking that like okay, how come we can have a change? What can we do to have a change? And that's actually, I don't have an answer, and you don't have an answer for that, but all together we can start to look for an answer. And that's one reason for the film. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about your views about the future of US political culture and the future of the parties. We have seen lots of polarization and divisions with both in the Republicans and in the Democratic Party. So what's your view about the future of US politics?
Yipes, the future of US politics. You know, one of the things I just echo one thing that Indy said, which is, I think there's something very legitimate about a group of Finnish filmmakers making a film about the United States. And I think it's often, you know, in the United States, there's such a kind of sense of jingoism and American centrism and, you know, American firstism that anybody else commenting on us is somehow illegitimate. But I think it's worth noting that we were in Italy, Bernardine and I recently, and Bernardine compared Trump to Berlusconi. And our friends in Italy said, no, there's no comparison. Berlusconi's a clown, and Trump is a clown. But Berlusconi does not have the nuclear codes, and he doesn't have a $1 trillion military establishment. That reality makes commentary from Europe, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, legitimate. We have to, all of us as citizens of the world, have to look at the source of some of the problems we face, like nuclear holocaust, which suddenly is amping up in a way that has been unthinkable since the 50s. And it's terrifying, right? But also global warming and catastrophic climate change. The heartland of this is somewhere else, and you have every right not only to comment on it, but to intervene in it. And I think, you know, even if you look at a short glance at history, those of you who are North American specialists, you know that de Tocqueville wrote the definitive case about the American democracy. He was a Frenchman. Charles Dickens wrote the most insightful work about American prisons. He was an Englishman. So you have every right not only to comment on, but to intervene in American politics. The future, I can't predict, but what I do know is that we're in a deep, deep crisis, and our political parties are in a deep crisis. And you could look at Trump as the triumph of white supremacy, which in some sense it is. You could also look at it as the last gasp of a dying empire, and in some ways it is that. That doesn't mean that it's going to be peaceful or sweet or calm or not genocidal. I don't know. But what I do know is it's our responsibility to look squarely at the crisis that we're facing, organize ourselves, reach out to more people, talk to strangers. Parenthetically, I'm a huge believer in talking to strangers, and I think it's the essence of democracy. And ironically, you might find this ironic, Bernardine and I had tickets to the inauguration. So when Donald Trump said he saw 1.5 million people on the mall in Washington, I don't know if you read that live, but he pretended that his inauguration had 1.5 million people. 2 of those people were actually us. We were there, and we got tickets because our aldermen were from the south side of Chicago, a mostly black district. Our aldermen couldn't give away the tickets. Nobody wanted to go to the inauguration, but we wanted to go. And we went with a big banner that said, "Say no to racism, say no to Islamophobia." And we engaged in conversation for 3.5 hours with Trump people, and it was marvelous. I mean, it was threatening a couple of times. Mostly it was marvelous. And you know, and marvelous conversations happened, and you find points of unity where you had no idea you could have them. So Bernardine kept saying to people, one woman cursed at her, and Bernardine said, "I'll bet you and I agree about some things." And she said, "Like what?" And Bernie said, like, if there's a child starving, we should feed that child. And she said, yes, but not the government. Okay, calm down. You know, we can talk now. But the point is that we have to engage in organizing. We have to reach out. Could the two major American political parties collapse? They could. And then there would be a realignment. Could there be a third party? There could be. Legally, it's very complicated to organize a third party in the United States. And every time it's been tried, the goalposts have been moved and making it more impossible. So it's unlikely that Bernie Sanders will organize a third party or Elizabeth Warren. But I think it's also really important to say that in the political culture of the United States, even a brief glance at history will tell you that it's social movements, mass movements from below, that change the culture. It's not the good ideas of Supreme Court justices or nice presidents. That doesn't change things. So you think about the 1960s and the great uprising of the Black freedom movement in the 50s and 60s. Lyndon Johnson was a cracker from Texas who passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. He didn't come to him in his own mind. It came because of fire from below. People forget that it wasn't King begging for an audience with Johnson. It was Lyndon Johnson asking King to please come to the White House to avoid this revolution. And that's worth noting. Franklin Roosevelt was never part of the labor movement. He was never part of the working class. He passed the most far-reaching labor legislation because of fire from below. Lincoln was never part of an abolitionist party. He became an abolitionist 4 years into his presidency because of fire from below. That's all we can do. We spend too much time looking at the sites of power we have no access to, like the White House, like the medieval auction block that we call the Congress, and too little time looking at the place of employment, the classroom, the church, the synagogue, the temple. And the workplace. This is where we should pay attention, because this is where we have free access to organize a real social movement that could really change things. And I couldn't be more hopeful, even though I'm terrified about what's going on in my country right now.
That was an awesome answer. I think I have a really big question.
Are you grading my answers? Wait a minute. She's giving me a grade.
No,
Also.
I'm not. Well,
I'm teasing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a really big question. And it is, what does democracy mean to you? What do you mean by democracy, and how has time maybe impacted your thinking on that?
You know, I grew up, I mean, when I came of age, I kind of like the slogan, "This is what democracy looks like." And the more chaotic the scene, the more I like the slogan. You know, as a lifelong teacher, I've been an opponent of labels. I don't think labels are very clarifying. And when you're teaching kids to call one kid behavior disordered or one kid, you know, special ed, those labels don't really help much. I've also resisted labeling people who label me a communist, a terrorist, or this or that. Everybody's always more complicated. So when it comes to, if I had to pick a labels for myself, I would say when it comes to the government, I'm an anarchist. When it comes to the economy, I'm a socialist. When it comes to free speech, I'm a fundamentalist. And I can go, when it comes to sex, I won't go there. But you know, so I can label myself, but I don't think there's a lot to be gained from that. What I do think is that democracy, to me, is a form of kind of anarcho-socialism. That is, everyone is equal not only before the law, but everyone is considered a person of agency and dimensionality that has to be taken into account. So to me, I came of age, and Students for Democratic Society and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we were sister organizations. We had as our fundamental premise that the most oppressed people were the people who were going to transform themselves and transform society for all of us, and that we should therefore work with the most oppressed. One of our slogans was, "Let the people decide." And our idea was, I moved into poor neighborhoods and organized poor people to let the people decide. And I think that I have the strong belief that ordinary people acting in their own interest have the capacity to transform the world and themselves. And that, to me, is participatory democracy, not representative democracy, not democracy that comes from afar with fake choices between, you know, the Repulsocrats and whoever. I mean, you know, that real democracy means participation in the social and civic life. It's a bigger question than that, but.
I have a question to all of you. One of the positive aspects of this government is that there's been a lot of grassroots mobilization. And what I see continuously are these Republican town hall meetings where the congressmen don't show up, and then the people are like passionately defending Obamacare and their right for health care and telling stories, these powerful stories about family members dying. And so there is a new social movement, or various social movements. They also seem to be very interactive in the sense that, or intersectional in the sense that the women's movement wasn't just about women, it was about immigrants and the environment and Planned Parenthood and Black Lives Matter. So there seems to be something going on that nobody really, well, perhaps they anticipated a little bit with Occupy Wall Street, but it's a different type of movement because regular folks are getting involved the way. So I wanted to ask you about that, and then also you guys had some scenes from those. So what did you experience when you were in the United States and filming that and talking to the folks who were involved?
Well, yeah, on the one hand, it's a terrible, terrible set of events brought us this uprising of resistance. And so I can't celebrate what happened, even though I completely agree with you that the response has been heartening in a way that was unpredictable. The Women's March was the most extraordinary thing I've ever participated in. I've never seen anything like it. There was no real organization, there was no real headquarters. It was a spontaneous million people in one city and millions across the land and across the world. And the humor of it, the goodwill of it, the sense of solidarity and intersectionality, although I like you saying intersexuality, I go with both. But the intersectionality of it, which is a new term, kind of an academic term, but it's an old idea. It's the idea that my freedom doesn't count if it doesn't include black freedom, that my only chance of being a decent human being is the women's movement. Even though I'm a man, getting the privileges of being a man, I know that my life is constrained without women's freedom, and so on. So that's a great thing, and it's very exciting. And it wouldn't have happened had this earthquake not happened in November. So, I just read this wonderful book by Jack Halberstam, Judith Halberstam at the time she wrote it, called The Queer Art of Failure. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Isn't that a great book?
Yeah.
Kind of made me want to, I don't know what, jump off of something. But the thesis of the book is when everything is normal, your relationship, your career, the world, it may be all fucked up, but you just ride along with it, So we were going to Washington, Bernadine and I, with our peace signs. We were going to picket Hillary Clinton, goddamn war maker, Holy shit. It was no longer normal. So our normal protests couldn't be normal. Suddenly we had to rethink everything. That's both a great thing and it comes out of a horrifying set of circumstances. But I think we have to jump on it and we have to notice a couple things. One is we have to notice that the spontaneity of the resistance has not died down. The airport demonstrations were extraordinary. I don't know if you saw these, but it was not planned. Nobody planned it. Trump signs a Muslim ban all over the country. People go, we went to O'Hare Airport and we went to the international terminal and we stormed the place. We said, welcome, welcome, come in. That wasn't planned, that just happened. And it wasn't just the hardcore radicals, it was everybody. So that's encouraging. The other thing, just to add to the kind of what the scene is, it's not just Occupy. Occupy, a lot of, again, mainstream commentators will say about Occupy, it didn't work. What the fuck does work mean in that context? It changed the conversation in a way that was unpredictable. Suddenly we were talking about wealth inequality. Suddenly we had a metaphor, the 1% and the 99%. That came out of Wall Street, incredible. But let's not forget that Black Lives Matter is on the ground. It's the latest iteration of a centuries-old Black freedom movement. That's thrilling. The women's movement is on the ground. the undocumented and unafraid kids who came out of Chicago is on the ground. So it's not, we're not starting from nowhere, just like Trumpism isn't coming from nowhere. We're not coming from nowhere either. And finding a way to converge and build an actual social movement out of these different movements is our task, and it's a daunting task. But there are two things, last thing to point to, which is that whenever a movement springs up like this, the first response is by power is to ignore it. The next response is to ridicule it. The next response is to co-opt it. So you may remember that during Occupy Wall Street, after they ignored it for a long time and then made fun of it, then Bill Clinton was offering advice on what they should wear in order to be effective. What? Get out of here, you know, get on the microphone, get on the people's mic and shut up. But so this is what's happening now. There's an attempt to co-opt this energy and say, get into the Democratic Party, come into the Democratic Party. The danger of that and the failure of that is partly the whole problem of electoral politics, but it's partly that for 4 decades, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have agreed about several major things. Permanent war, that's a Democrat as well as a Republican idea. Mass incarceration begins with the Democrats and is furthered by the Republicans, and Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, is a monster, but he's a monster who's following in the footsteps of other horrible policies. The destruction of the public space, including public education. Yes, Betsy DeVos, our Minister of Education, whatever you call her, Secretary of Education, is a monster, and Arnie Duncan was a monster. He was a liberal monster. So, but he laid the pavement down because he agreed that education is a product, not a right. So when Betsy DeVos says, let's sell it, it's hard for him to say, I'm the opposition. So my fear is that all this energy is being, you know, the powerful are trying to draw it into an acceptable opposition, and we have to figure out a way to keep it being a social movement that mobilizes humanity on its own behalf and doesn't get sucked into the Democratic Party, which is also for permanent war and mass incarceration and all the rest.
Okay, and Bill already gave all the answers
No,
possible.
I didn't. No.
But I want to point something out, because one reason for this film was also this cycle, that we are on this cycle. So 50 years ago happened what is actually happening right now at the moment. So like a cycle in the film, in the beginning and in the end. Like my question would be that, are we ever getting out of the cycle? Are we just repeating the history and never learning? And now I feel in the United States and also globally, I feel that there is something underneath that is bubbling right now, and at some point, right now it's still kind of feeling is friendly and it's a good movement at the moment, but my concern is that very soon there might be little groups here and there that are starting to build up bombs because they are so pissed that nothing is changing. So that's like, I don't want that to happen. So how do you keep this form or change so that it still it stays non-violent? Yeah, I don't know.
Did you want to say something about being in the United States?
Yeah, it was, I mean, we did the interviews when I don't think anyone believed Trump would be elected. It was just, so had we been there right after that, it would have been a bit different. But I think it's good, it's kind of in a way gives, it wasn't too affected because we didn't want to make the film about Trump's being elected. It was just like an afternote that, okay, this is what happened, and the doomsday clock advanced. So we added all that after the election, obviously. The other thing about activism, there's so many forms. This is my form of activism, producing this film. So this is what I do. This is what I can do. I have 2 little kids. I can't go and do other stuff at the moment so much. And globally, it's a global, like I think Trump, what do you call it, Trumpism?
I call it Trumpism.
Trumpism. I think it's great that we take every positive kind of thing out of that name, because that happens everywhere. And I live in Australia, it happens there as well. That right wing, it's party, it's one of the biggest parties in Australia at the moment, and it's scary. And I think everybody who wants to do something about it should do something about it without violence, of course.
You know, let me take issue with just one thing. I know you're moving on, but you know, I think that it's very important when we talk about violence that we understand that violence is not just the behavior of an individual or a group of people. It's actually structured into certain situations. So if you look at American slavery, people could live on a plantation, be completely peaceful, and that system is maintained by vicious violence, whether you see it or not. And the system of slavery is the violence. So whenever people talk about nonviolent resistance, and it's important always to say, King stood for nonviolent direct action, not nonviolence in the sense of sitting in a room smoking a joint, which I'm all for, but I don't think that that constitutes what King was talking about. You have to put yourself in opposition. In fact, King was very clear about showing the violence of the system by putting yourself in a place where the violence of the system would express itself. So we live in a sewer of violence in the United States, a $1 trillion military establishment, the destruction of governments everywhere. And what would infuriate all of you, I think, if you were in the US, is how innocent Americans paint themselves when it comes to things like the immigrant crisis in Europe. That's not our problem, that's your problem. We didn't do anything, we're innocent. That is so preposterous, and yet that's the position that people take. So we have to point out always, when we talk about violence, even things like the young anarchists in Berkeley who break windows in banks, I don't necessarily think that's the greatest thing in the world, but I'll be damned if I'm gonna spend all my energy saying, don't break the windows, be nice. Fuck that. The people who are really the violent people are the ones who are creating war around the world, destroying Libya, creating the immigration crisis. That's the violence we should condemn first and foremost, and we should never condemn the violence of a group of kids who are hot-headed before we condemn that other. And Martin Luther King couldn't have been clearer about it. You read his later writings, it will stun you if you're caught in the mythology of the nonviolent warrior. He was more than that, and he was smarter than that. But so I think we should condemn the real violence, and then I think we should always say, nonviolent direct action is a fabulous tactic in the hands of the people, and let's use it, but it has to be direct action.
Well, okay, yeah.
Last question.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about like the inner strife in student movement organizations. You mentioned Tom Hayden, who wouldn't necessarily agree with you, but
we were good friends on the other hand. He was a good guy.
Right, and then there's others like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. How much of that discussion continued when you were underground? And then the second part is to the international scene, where we know the student movement was international in like 1968 and what happened in Europe. Did you have any communications with radical groups in Europe whilst underground?
You know, when we were underground, we were cut off from all international relations, so we didn't have any contact with Cuba or Vietnam or you know, the International Communist Conspiracy, wherever that's headquartered, I don't know, nor with the Green Party or Danny Cohn-Bendit or anybody. But before we went underground, Bernadine was the international secretary of SDS, so she had vibrant relationships with the SDS in France. She had a vibrant relationship with the student movement in Italy, Germany, England. And what's interesting also, when you isolate the weathermen as this kind of weird phenomenon, and you forget things like 20,000 bombings in a 2-year period, but you also forget the Angry Brigade in England. You forget Baader-Meinhof. You forget the Red Army faction. This was a world phenomenon, and it was, again, it was illegal. You could argue that it went off the tracks, and I wouldn't always disagree with you. I mean, there were things about it that were quite weird, but it wasn't isolated here or there. And what Bernadine would say if she was here is that the Weather Underground of all of those groups was the most restrained, that we did go through a period where we killed 3 of our own members, but we were quite restrained compared to Baader-Meinhof or the Red Army faction or the Tupamaros or a lot of other groups. And so, you know, I think that, but we didn't have contact. We were kind of on our own at that point. But before 69, 70, we had vibrant relationships with the Vietnamese. In fact, I remember, I didn't meet the Vietnamese until much later, but Bernardine had many meetings with the Vietnamese, including a big meeting in Prague. They had a meeting set up with the Vietnamese and the international student movement, and the Russian tanks came in and invaded right when they were having their meeting. So they had to scatter and go meet elsewhere. But Bernardine told me a story about, I picked her up in Canada. She was coming back from Cuba, where they'd had a series of meetings with the Vietnamese and they'd cut sugar and all that. And she described the SDS people telling the Vietnamese our grand plans for overthrowing the US government. And they all listened very politely. And then they said, have you talked to your Republican parents yet? You know, which was a way of saying, talk to strangers, organize the bastards who you can organize. And your grand schemes for revolution are fine, and we're not putting you down, but we're also urging you to be organizers. And I take that to heart.
Okay, well, thank you all for such a wonderful discussion and proving that there are other Finns than the shy ones who never ask questions. So, Turku folks, yes. And thank you guys so much. This has been a fabulous afternoon. And too bad we're running out of time, but let the dialogue continue in one way or another.
Appreciate it.
So let's give it up to.
Before you all go, I want to show you, this is not the newest book, third newest book of Bill Ayres. It came out like a year ago.
September, I think, or August, yeah.
Yeah, but we are translating this in Finnish, Vaadi mahdotonta, Radicalism, and it will be out later this year. So,
which publishing house?
It's together with Voima-lehti and MAN.
Oh,
yes.
Thank you all.
And go tell your friends to see the film from 19th of this month.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Let's take a bathroom break and then outside.
All right.
And walk to the court.
Okay, is it far?
No, it's like right now.
Okay, perfect. We have a...
Tulet varmaan, haluatko tänne? Joo.
You are traveling life.
Yes.
Joo, pistys.
Tuohon varmaan. Mä luulen, että se oli